ICN started back in 1984 in Victoria, and the reason we started was to give small businesses an opportunity to link up with projects. Very soon, we spread across the country and onto New Zealand as well. The reason for our success? The reputation that we have built over the years with project owners. Don't forget that we have a very committed and skilled team of consultants across the country working in our local ICN offices. They verify the small businesses that they work with and link them up with the projects. There are no restrictions when it comes to the project side of things. We can work with anyone locally, regionally, and even globally. However, if you happen to be a small business, you need to be registered in Australia or New Zealand.
All right. Well, welcome back to the last session of today. And look, it's certainly not last but not least, or should I say, it's last but not least for sure. We've got a very, very interesting and engaging final presenter, and that's Mr. Mick Saddler from Solution Assemblers. A little bit about Mick. He specializes in working with organizations to take the worry out of cybersecurity. I told you this one is going to be a cracker. With more than 25 years in IT, he is highly skilled at breaking technical challenges down into easily understood pieces, empowering his clients to understand and take control of their environments. Mick has worked with some of Australia's largest organizations, delivering projects to anything from many thousands of users right down to teams as small as 10. In more recent times, his cybersecurity skills have been instrumental in helping organizations identify their greatest risks, prioritize the actions to take, and execute the remediation needed to keep them ahead of the curve. His true passion at conferences is to pass on his version of cybersecurity from the trenches, so that attendees can walk away with practical, digestible, actionable insights that will add value to their professional experience moving forward. Without further ado, let me welcome Mick to the podium. Hi,
Thanks
Mick.
very much, Mike.
Thank you so much. I'll hand over to you.
Oh, thank you both very much. So it's very exciting for me, actually, because as you guys know, I'm a nerd. So normally I sort of get kept in a dark room out the back, and I get to come out here and talk to people a little bit. So it's terrific. So look, what we want to do today is cover a couple of different topics, and I'm going to talk about what this is all about, the whole cybersecurity thing from my perspective. And of course, we have to have a few stats, and then pretty much every cybersecurity talk is going to have that. We want to talk about where to start and give you some ideas on how to start your journey, or if you've started already, how to focus that journey. And then we're going to talk about risk, because an important part, of course, of cybersecurity work is understanding what the actual risk is to your organization so that you know what to prioritize. Then we're going to move into the Essential 8, which some of you may have already heard about. And this is a great framework for being able to do a bit of a check for where you're at, where you want to go to, and making sure you've covered all your bases. We'll talk briefly about AI, which I consider to be your ace in the hole in terms of cybersecurity, and how you can use that in your journey to make sure you stay ahead of the curve. And then finally, a few recommendations to wrap up, and hopefully time for questions. So to me, this is what cybersecurity is all about. You've all heard that story, I'm sure. You've got two guys in the jungle being chased by a lion, and they both run up a tree. And while they're up the tree, one of them bends down and starts to tie up his laces. And his friend says to him, "What's the point tying up your lace? You're not going to be able to outrun the lion." And the friend says, "I don't need to outrun the lion. I just need to outrun you." Now, to me, that's what cybersecurity is all about. It's actually not possible to have 100% security. It's very much like house security or security for the physical premises for your business. There's always going to be a way in, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're making it difficult. You want to make sure that you've got everything in place so that if an attacker comes to your door, they try a couple of things and then move on. So we're going to go and talk about this obligatory slide. We said we're going to have some statistics, and 80% of the statistics are made up, I believe. I don't know who's actually said that first time, but I love that quote. But really the most important thing here is going to be talking about some of the advice rather than dwelling on the numbers. So So let's just get some of the numbers out of the way. This one I do want to emphasize though, because this particular slide is talking about multi-factor authentication. And of course, we will touch on that a couple of times a little bit later in this presentation, but multi-factor authentication in simple terms means having more than just a password to protect what's important to your organization, having another factor as well, which might be an SMS, might be an authenticator, something like that. So the vast majority of compromises happen when people don't have that in place. So even if you were to get to this point in the presentation and say, all right, I think I've had enough, it's been a long day, I'm going to go, make sure you put in place multi-factor authentication, because it's by far and away the most value you'll get from any sort of cybersecurity activity that you undertake. And then if we look a little bit more deeply into that, there's this statistic about replay attacks. And what those are is where hackers will find credentials, and there are millions and millions of them available to them on the dark web. And they'll take those credentials, put it into software that will go and hit all these different accounts. It'll try your LinkedIn account, your Instagram account, your Facebook account, all these different things with those credentials, trying to see whether it can get in. And because there's so much reuse of passwords, that is very often a very successful approach for them to take. Now, you'll notice on here, around the middle of the slide there, that I've mentioned a site called Have I Been Pwned? Now, if you grab this deck later, you'll be able to click on that. That's an active link, and it will take you to a site where you can put in your email address, anyone in your organization, anyone in your family. It's completely free, but it will tell you whether there are known credentials linked to your email address that are floating around on the dark web. If you find something like that, there's not really too much need for panic. There's two things you need to do. One is to create a new password. We usually recommend 12 characters or more. And the second one is to introduce that second factor of authentication. Okay, and then finally, this stat here is just talking about the fact that within an organization, within an enterprise, typically more than 60% of users will reuse their passwords there. And I think one of the things to call out here is to seriously consider, if you don't already, having a password manager, and that can be individually installed on each user's mobile device if they want to use it that way. Most password managers will allow multiple installations, so it can be on your phone, it can be on your laptop, and various other locations as well. Or most of you would have seen when you're browsing to sites that quite often it will ask you after you've entered credentials whether you want to save them. Now, technically speaking, there are safer ways to save passwords, but if it comes down to choosing between saving a password that way or saving it in a less secure way, then I would go with that. So for the majority of cases, I think saving on your browser is okay. All right, so let's look at some of the best places to start on our journey in this cybersecurity examination. And one of the things we want to do is have a look at what sorts of risks are going to be the most relevant to us in this investigation. And I've got 3 examples here. Now, they're by no means all of the examples, but they give you an idea of the sorts of things you may choose to look at when you're trying to, I guess, have a look at your own situation and see what types of risk are most likely to affect you. And the reason we want to do that, of course, is because when we look at the frameworks in the next part of this presentation, we'll be thinking about those in the context of the risk that matters to us. So, for example, here we've got an example of a data breach risk. And, you know, if your organization looks like it fits the criteria that we're outlining here, then you may focus on things that protect your data over and above the operation of your business. Maybe you've got a lot of very sensitive information. Maybe you hold a lot of customer data. Maybe there are things which, if leaked, would destroy the business, you know. So that is a data breach risk as a primary focus. If we have a look at another example, this is a very popular one, a phishing risk. If your organization sends and receives enormous volumes of emails, if you have a lot of people accessing email, if you have a workforce that doesn't use email very often, so might be in a rush and open emails without checking them, those sorts of things, then a phishing risk is the sort of thing that you'd want to focus on. And then if we have something like an insider threat risk, now this is perhaps something that's a little bit unpopular to think about, but the reality is in most organizations, there can be times when either a disgruntled worker or something like that goes looking for things that they perhaps shouldn't, And you've got to make sure that those things are protected as well. And if you had that sort of risk inside your environment, you might take a slightly different view to the things we're about to discuss here. So with that risk in mind, we want to start looking at some of the mitigations that are available to us. Now, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the Essential 8. The Australian Signals Directorate, or ACSC, have published guidance for a number of years now, and that guidance has been the culmination of a number of frameworks from all different locations, primarily out of the US with NIST or with CIS. Effectively, what the Essential 8 has done has been to grab 8 of those components and capture those here for the Australian market. And so in the list that we've got here on this slide, you can see multi-factor authentication is very deliberately bigger than the others because, as we said before, that's a very important focal point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each of those 8 different controls. Now, they're called controls because each one of those exhibits some control over your environment, and there are various different controls you can have in place. And once again, with this deck, that Essential 8 there, this logo here, that's a live link. So you'll be able to go and actually click on that link, and it'll take you to the Essential 8 site if you haven't already been there. So let's have a look at multi-factor authentication. Now, I'm not a big fan of going through and reading everything on the slide. You'll be able to do that later. Really what I want to do is just sort of give you, I suppose, some background on what really matters in that process of setting up your multi-factor authentication. And I think one of the things that is very important to have in mind is to aim for the highest level of security you can with the least amount of inconvenience. And that's one of the challenges with anything cybersecurity. You're always balancing up those two competing priorities of security and convenience. Okay, so with multi-factor authentication, one of the best bang for your buck approaches at the moment is to use the Authenticator app. Now, by Authenticator app, of course, what I mean is the app that you can go and install on your phone. And that's because it's very, very hard for hackers to intercept that. An SMS they can spoof, a text message they can intercept via email, and various things like that. So generally speaking, using the Authenticator app or something called a FIDO key, which is a physical device that you slot into a USB port on a laptop or something like that, those factors are much more difficult for cybersecurity attackers to get around. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the next one of these points in the framework, which is restricting admin access. And I guess one of the other ways that's often spoken about is privileged account management. Now, I've gone and worked at organizations or worked for organizations where they have almost everybody having admin access. And while that might not necessarily seem to be such a bad thing, the worst part of that is if any single one of those people is compromised through any method at all, they put the entire organization at risk. So you really want to do reviews of the number of people that have admin access on a regular basis. They absolutely are the keys to the kingdom. And depending on your level of sophistication and maturity, you can even get to the point of doing what's called PIM-PAM, privileged identity management, or privileged account management, access management, I should say, so that you can give windows of opportunity to have that access and then switch it off again. Because the more you can restrict that, the more you can reduce your risk. Now, if we look at patching operating systems, I've got in the top left there that this is what I would call easy protection, unless you have a large environment. Unless you have hundreds or thousands of servers, then it starts to become exponentially more difficult. But the good thing about medium or smaller environments is that they tend to be less affected by applying updates and patches to operating systems. Now, if you're a Mac user, you can turn on automatic updates, and that will effectively take care of this problem for you. If you're a Windows user, there are also Windows updates, and depending on the size of your environment and the complexity of whether or not you have an IT department, you can set up schedules in which those updates will automatically check and run. You have Patch Tuesdays, all sorts of things like that you can look at. But broadly speaking, patching the operating system is a very valuable thing to do because operating systems are so widespread, hackers know that it's very well worth their while to go after operating systems that are not patched. And of course, when new patches come out, they watch to see those patches come out and then look for environments that exhibit that vulnerability. So a very worthwhile thing to do. Patching applications, of course, is stepping one layer back from that. And in a lot of cases, so let's say it's Office, Microsoft Office or something like that, it's actually quite straightforward to go and get patches and updates for those applications as they become available. But in some cases, you're going to find that you need to actually go to the author or manufacturer or creator of the application in question and either register for updates for when they distribute their updates or when they do patches or anything like that, just to make sure that you're at the forefront of those things as they're occurring and as they're happening. Now, backups, I think, is an interesting one because, of course, all of you are thinking how obvious this is, and it is very obvious. But one thing that I think is really good advice to just have in the back of your mind is make sure that your backups are very well hidden. So I have a friend of mine that had a 6-person company that was the victim of a phishing attack. And the breach occurred during the day, and at night after they'd all gone home, the attackers got in, found their backups, deleted them, and then deployed ransomware and encrypted all of their content right throughout the organization. Now, he was very, very fortunate in that he was able to negotiate with the hackers and get back enough information that he could recover his business, but he could never recover those backups. So any good hacker, one of the first things they're going to do if they breach your environment is hunt out those backups and delete them. Now, this one I've got in the top left corner, I'm calling this great control, but hard to manage. And the reason I say that, application control, in theory, is a wonderful thing to have in place if you can do it. And effectively what you're doing is you are whitelisting applications so that your users have a selection of things that they can use anytime they need to use them, but which also blocks them from going and downloading other things off the internet that may be full of malware or may have inadvertent vulnerabilities that put you at risk. The problem with application control that I've seen in the environments I've worked in is that it requires constant attention, and you need to be making sure that you're adding and removing applications as they become relevant. It's also a very expansive area. You can imagine how many applications most organizations have. So it can be a big nut to crack. That's why I've got it this far down in terms of my prioritization of those 8 items in the list, because I think in terms of bang for buck, it probably doesn't give as much bang as it incurs in buck. Application hardening is talking about quite specific cases where you have custom solutions that have been created for you. So you may have had developers in that have written an application for your organization. You might have Excel spreadsheets that have very high functionality and are quite core to your business. Any number of things that have been highly customized. The more customized they are, the more possible it is that they may have a vulnerability in them. And unfortunately, trying to find those vulnerabilities can be fairly costly, not just in terms of the impact it can have if there's a breach, but you can do something called penetration testing, where you employ someone to come in and try to effectively get into that application as a way of testing the level of security that it's offering. But it's an expensive exercise to do, and hence why it's quite far down the list. Then if we look at, I think it's our last one actually, Office macros. This is our 8th point. And we've all heard about macros being vulnerable to such a degree that if you're currently using Microsoft 365, by default, Office macros will be switched off, disabled. And there's a very good reason for that. Now, if you find that your organization does have a need for macros, what you can do is you can segment your user base. You can set up things in such a way that users X, Y, and Z can run macros, but nobody else. And even better, you can review those permissions, say every month or something like that, and switch them off wherever they're no longer necessary. All of those things yes, they're a little bit inconvenient, but they dramatically improve your security posture, and they definitely pay off in terms of keeping you safe. So now I want to talk about what I've called here your ace in the hole. And that's because I use this extensively, and it's artificial intelligence. Now, we've all heard various different things about artificial intelligence. I think one of the interesting things to consider is that it's available to us as defenders, and it's also available, of course, to the bad actors out there that will be using it against us. Now, when you talk throughout the industry to a lot of the cybersecurity experts out there, it's generally fairly widely accepted that the benefit that we as defenders can get from using AI appropriately is greater than the benefit that attackers can get from using AI, which I think is pretty good news. And let's just jump in here and have a bit of a look. Some of you may be doing this already, but if you're not, I would thoroughly recommend spending the time to do this, because the amount that you'll get back from this approach is very substantial. And I think, to me, one of the things that is a very big change in terms of how I use AI versus the, I'm using air quotes again, old world, where we used to go to a browser and just search, is with AI, it's much more about being a conversation. So it's fairly small here, but if you look closely at what I've got on that slide there, you'll see that the question I've formulated has got a paragraph, there's 3 different points, then there's another sentence below, and you can even add something to the bottom of that that might say, feel free to ask me any clarifying questions if you need to. The degree to which you can ask complex questions to AI is absolutely astounding. And I think in terms of it being a fantastic sounding board and a great learning platform is unparalleled. So I would recommend, if you're not doing this already, to treat your interactions with AI like they're a discussion. Now, before I go too far, let me just make mention of the fact that there are an increasing number of AI tools available to us. We've got ChatGPT that I think most people have heard of. We've also got Copilot, and there are numerous others, Bard, others coming out, but they all fundamentally work the same way. So I would recommend going through, asking a question, then asking a follow-up question, then asking a deeper question, then saying, I don't quite understand that. Can you explain that to me in more detail? Or can you make that simpler? That explanation is more complex than I need for this scenario. Whatever it is, I would encourage you to be iterative in the way that you interact with your AI sessions. So look, we're nearly there. I'm just going to go very quickly through some recommendations here, and then we'll finish up. I mentioned to you a little earlier on, have I been pwned? So I just threw this in the recommendations here to make sure you didn't miss it. Very well worth spending the time on this. And as I said, free. Business email compromise. I've given that its own slide here just to highlight the fact that as technology gets better, the weak link starts to become us, humans, because we're easier to compromise in a lot of cases than the technology is. And the word going around, business email compromise, is becoming more and more common, and I suspect will continue to become more common as the technology continues to evolve. And then here, again, we don't need to go into too much detail. If we step back and look at this from a high-level view, you'll recognize a number of things here in just general recommendations throughout the industry for ways to improve protection from attacks. You'll recognize multi-factor authentication at the top of that list, zero trust, which is where we talked about winding back admin privileges or making sure not everyone has them. Detection we haven't gone into, that's a whole different discipline, but keeping up to date we talked about, and protecting data with good backups and things like that as well. Now, finally, we just want to make the point here to say that cybersecurity is a journey. It's not something you do once and then think it's fine and move on. It's constantly evolving. It's growing. For the attackers, unfortunately, it's a very, very profitable exercise. So unfortunately, it's only going to become more and more prevalent as time moves forward. But with these sorts of tools and this approach in your back pocket, hopefully it gives you a context to be able to have a proper strategy and something in place that means you've checked all the boxes before checking all the most important things that are relevant to your organization. So just to finish off here, it has been a bit of a whirlwind, I know. I'm going to make a couple of points. I don't know if any of you noticed, every single one of the images in this deck has come from AI. It's come from me just asking for a couple of guys running away from a lion, and I kept that thing going right throughout from top to bottom. So none of those are my fault. That's what AI can do for you. We covered a number of different things. We talked about what cybersecurity is all about, and it's all about being better than your neighbor. We went through some stats. We, I think, had a pretty good idea of where to get started. We talked about risk and risk profiles. And the important point is remembering to have that risk in mind when you look at any sort of vulnerability framework, whatever it might be. If there's a vulnerability, but there's no risk to you, don't worry about that vulnerability. We talked about the Essential 8 as a framework that you can go and use as a reference. We've got links in there for that. We talked about AI as your ace in the hole. And we had a couple of recommendations we've raced through at the end. That's all I really want to cover. Does anyone want to ask any questions?
Wow, Mick, that did not disappoint. You certainly packed a lot into that one. And as the final presentation of the day, that was really useful stuff. I think I could hear the IT team here cheering from next door as you validated all the things that they drum into us on a regular basis. So, no, thank you very much. That was a great presentation.
Very kind, thank you.
So we, yep, sorry, I just caught myself there. So look, I had so many takeaways from today. I don't know about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's been a fantastic array of speakers, Louise. I think thinking back on the whole event, we've had such a contrasting mix of speakers that have covered off various different elements of IT and the ICT side of things. Look, I think Mick's presentation certainly brought it home and touched on the most critical elements of what the challenges are around ICT and what we need to do to secure our entities, both from a personal perspective as well as from a company perspective, right? So look, thank you so much, and a big thank you to all our speakers for today. It's been a huge day for everyone, and just wanted to again recognize our primary sponsors. Louise, without stating the obvious, we wouldn't have been able to have this day without them. And in particular reference to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, thank you so much for your support to Construct Maps, for your support and your presentation, and Innovation Central Canberra for your silver sponsorship. Again, thank you so much for joining us on this critical event, and I think it's been enormous. I know my phone has been lighting up throughout the day with people touching base to see what else we can do together. So thank you so much for that.
And don't forget to keep the conversation going after the event on your socials. Keep sharing and using hashtag ICN event, because we want to hear your takeaways and your impression of what you got from the day. So, yep, please keep doing that. And don't forget to submit your testimonial. So whether that be a video or a written testimonial, we're looking for people to get creative and give us your feedback. You'll be in the running for a free premium subscription to Gateway by ICN.
And this is all about ICN, right? So the testimonial needs to be about your fantastic interaction, your fantastic experience.
The presenters,
I'm hoping that we're being obvious, exactly. And look, before you leave today on that note, don't forget to complete the Summit feedback survey. Look, I mean, you don't have to put 10, but it will certainly help, in terms of numbers. And we've got a grade back, just like Uber No, I'm only kidding. We don't. But thank you again to all our sponsors. Thank you to everyone who's stuck with us throughout the day. And we hope that the event has been fruitful for you. And on that note, just one final plug. We've got to save the date for the 14th of August, our Parliament House event. And we'd like to invite everyone to attend the Parliament House event, and please save the date for the 14th of August, and you will no doubt get a lot of social media involved as far as the event is concerned. So thank you again, and Louise and I both bid you farewell.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.